Hello and welcome to this webinar on Bigleaf maple sugaring. If you're watching this means you're interested in making maple syrup using our native bigleaf maple species, Acer macrophylla. So in this webinar, we'll be discussing multiple different aspects of bigleaf maple sugaring, including a lot of technical stuff, but this is ultimately geared towards a hobbyist that is trying to make bigleaf maple syrup for the first time. I am Patrick Schultz. I'm an extension forester with Washington State University. I have been doing outreach and studying bigleaf maple sugaring for several years now. I picked up quite a few tricks that I'm hoping to share with you to make your first attempt a little bit easier. Getting started, if I can get my slide to move here. What we'll be covering, we'll start with a little bit of background, a little more information on sugaring in the Northwest, talk about what causes sap flow in maples, and we'll get into tapping, of course, collecting sap and then processing that sap into syrup, finishing, filtering, and storing. And although this is focused on the hobbyist, we will discuss commercial opportunities to make income selling bigleaf maple syrup, and some additional resources. All right, so jumping into it, as I promised, a little bit of background on sugaring in the Pacific Northwest. Should come as no surprise that maple syrup is really more synonymous with states like Vermont or Michigan or New York, not so much Washington, Oregon. So, there's minimal history of maple sugaring in the region, and that includes minimal history of indigenous use of maple sap. There is some evidence, but it's pretty limited, and a big reason for that is likely that the sap in bigleaf maple has a much lower sugar content compared to that of the aptly named sugar maple in the eastern part of the country, where there is a really rich history of indigenous use of maple sap, just because it was easier to process, most likely. Now, that doesn't mean that people haven't been doing it in this region, but it's been predominantly hobbyists. I've met people that have been doing this for decades, using maples in their forests. Now, until recently, though, there was not any commercial sale of bigleaf maple syrup in Washington or really in the United States. There was some in British Columbia, but even that is quite recent. And that is largely due to advances in sugaring technology, particularly something called reverse osmosis, which we will touch on lightly. So that's leveled the playing field for the Northwest and really anywhere in the country or world where there are maples with lower sugar content compared to sugar maple. It's made it much easier to process sap into syrup, and we'll talk about why. Bigleaf maple syrup, though, has a really unique flavor, a unique story, and of course it's highly regional, and for that reason it has a very high value right now. That's what we'll talk about when we get into commercial opportunities. So there's been several efforts, particularly by that of the University of Washington, to set up commercial production for bigleaf maple syrup in this region, and part of that effort has WSU Extension and Oregon State University have also teamed up in that effort over the last several years to develop that commercial production, and that includes a lot of outreach and support for hobbyists. Just knowing that anyone that tries this is going to start at the hobby level. Anyone that ultimately becomes a commercial producer still starts with 5 to 10 trees, and also recognizing that there is a lot of value in hobbyist production, which we'll talk about more later. That includes agritourism opportunities. So a little more background. One of the reasons that this is such an exciting opportunity is that, one, there are great commercial and hobbyist opportunities, but bigleaf maple sugaring pairs really well with everyone on the spectrum from conservation to working forest objectives. It adds value to bigleaf maple, which is a historically maligned species because of its sort of weedy growth, but has really significant environmental benefits. Not everyone knows this about maple, but it has a lot of really great environmental benefits, including, of course, carbon sequestration. That's sort of the low-hanging fruit of it, but there's also really significant wildlife benefits. For instance, bigleaf maple produces early season sources of pollen for pollinators early in the spring. It can be a really important resource for pollinators. It also is really effective at building forest soils. So a number of benefits maple provides, probably been undervalued by the fact that it has very limited timber value. It's not completely valueless, but it's certainly not as valuable as Doug fir or western red cedar. So over the course of the last century or so, bigleaf maple has been maligned and largely gotten rid of in favor of some of these more valuable timber crop trees in spaces where timber is the objective. But adding value to it through bigleaf maple syrup production can help hopefully preserve some on the landscape. It works really well in riparian buffers, which of course riparian buffers are there's a lot of efforts out there to support the adoption of riparian buffers to protect and enhance fish habitat. And what this does is it can create working buffers, or buffers where there's continued opportunity for agricultural production or production for personal use for landowners. And then, of course, it can preserve forest land by providing alternative forest income or income in between timber harvests, which is additionally supportive of working forest objectives. All right, so into the technical parts. How does maple sap flow work? Well, this is a pretty unique process for maples, and anything in the Acer genus has this mechanism. And it is essentially a response to changes in temperatures, specifically freezing temperatures and warming temperatures. Followed in close succession, to be clear. So what's happening is freezing temperatures cause essentially a negative pressure inside the tree. So during the sap season, which for us here in the Northwest is going to be any time we can get a freeze, which would be largely between November and March. When we get those freezing temperatures, a vacuum or negative pressure occurs inside the tree because there is gaseous space, and this is what's pretty unique to maples, in the intercellular space within the stem. So when gas freezes, it contracts, and that contraction is what causes that negative pressure, which draws water from the soil. Even though the tree is dormant, it's drawing water from the soil up into the xylem, also called the sapwood, and then even up into the upper parts of the tree. In the process of drawing water into the stem, it's absorbing sugars and minerals and becoming sap. The warm temperatures, eventually, when after the freeze is over and the temperatures warm up, that sap thaws and begins to move downward. And the higher relative pressure inside the tree compared to outside the tree pushes the sap out through a tap hole that we drill in the tree. So that sort of mechanism of response to freeze thaw is very unique to maples. Other trees do produce sap, such as walnut and sycamore and birch, but that freeze thaw mechanism is really unique to maples. Birches, for instance, produce sap through a response to root pressure caused by warming soil in the spring, so a little bit different. But really important to understand this mechanism because it's going to determine when you tap in particular, which we'll talk about timing later. So what's in the sap? I mentioned that there's minerals. This is one of the beautiful parts about maple sap and maple sugar ultimately, is that it does tend to have a more diverse profile of nutrients compared to things like cane sugar or corn syrup. So there's minerals, vitamins, amino acids. Of course, there's sugar in there and lots of water. As we mentioned before, bigleaf maple syrup has a pretty low sugar content. It's generally around 1 to 1.5% by volume sugar. So a lot of that water has to go eventually, and of course we'll talk about that during the processing part. So one of the questions I always get is, does taking sap hurt the tree? The answer is technically yes. You're drilling a hole in the tree, which you are causing a wound, and you are withdrawing some resources from the tree. But we know from longitudinal studies on trees, tapped in the East Coast at least, comparing trees that have been tapped their whole life versus trees that were never tapped, that it really is a negligible causes a very negligible difference in growth, which is a really good reflection on health and stress. So this is also why we have sustainable tapping methods, which I'll get into, and ensuring we're not taking too much. And as long as we're not taking too much, what I like to compare it to is sort of drawing blood from the tree. You can go and you can donate blood, once a month or so, and as long as they're not taking too much, you're going to be just fine. And that is essentially the same process as the same is true for a tree as long as we're following those sustainable tapping methods. So don't worry too much about hurting your tree, especially most people know that bigleaf maple is actually quite difficult to kill. Many timber growers know that for sure. All right, so finding your sugar bush. This is kind of the next step. And if you aren't familiar with this term, your sugar bush is just wherever your maples are that you're tapping. It's sort of a folksy term for it that we got from the East Coast. So I don't want to assume that anyone knows or everyone knows how to identify bigleaf maple. I'm sure many do, but not everyone will be able to, or not everyone's like me and just stares at trees all day and can spot them, from 100 yards out. But it's also really important to be able to ID them during the winter, which is when we'll be tapping. So not everyone knows how to winter ID a maple as well. We'll talk about that here. So talking about with the leaves on, at least we can, it's pretty easy to ID. Bigleaf maple, true to its name, has very large leaves, often 12 inches across or more. Those leaves have 5 distinct lobes that give it that maple shape. Tend to be dark green on top, pale underneath. And then the last bit here is really important, which is that they are oppositely arranged. So here we're looking at buds, which would be future leaves. So the leaves and the stems and the buds are all going to be arranged directly opposite of each other, unless it's the terminal bud at the end of the twig, on the stem. And that's opposed to something like red alder, where it would be, you'd have a bud here and a bud here, and they would alternate up the stem. So that opposite arrangement is really distinct to species in the maple genus, the Acer genus. And specifically, there are very few large canopy trees in Washington that are going to have this opposite arrangement, in Western Washington at least. And in fact, there's only 2 species, bigleaf maple and Oregon ash. Oregon ash is also going to have that opposite arrangement. Now, it's pretty easy to tell Oregon ash from bigleaf maple and when the leaves are on the tree. During the winter, it can be maybe a little more difficult. And in forestry, we often get into winter twig ID. And that's by looking at the shape and form of the buds. And so what I like to say for maple is that the buds look kind of like a pope's hat or like a king's hat, something very royal. Whereas I don't have a picture of it here, but Oregon ash, if you were to look up a picture of those buds, they look a little bit like a Nestle's chocolate chip. So they're very distinct looking buds. And if you're ever really unsure in the winter, you could grab a twig and take a look at those, and you would be able to tell for sure. But one of the things that's really important to know too is that bigleaf maple and Oregon ash tend to grow in pretty different habitats. They might grow near each other, but Oregon ash really likes wet soils, as in standing in water. And maple, although it likes moist soils, really likes it to be well drained. It's a little more finicky that way. It wants moisture, but it wants it to kind of run through the soil. So maple won't be found in places really often, at least, where water is ponding much of the year, and that's where you're going to find ash. So I like to joke, in the winter, if you're unsure, look down and see if your feet are in water, and you might be looking at an ash if they are. Other identifiers in the spring, maple will produce these really long, beautiful greenish yellow flowers. These are edible and frankly delicious too. I really recommend, a great recipe is to make maple fritters of these, put a little cinnamon on them and dip them in maple syrup. You'll thank me later. It's a really great recipe. It makes all the work for making maple syrup worth it in the spring. So these flowers eventually turn into double-winged samaras, which are those famous helicopter seeds that we associate with maples, which those typically drop in in the fall, which is right about now. This is being recorded in October of 2024, by the way. So looking at the bark too, I mean, the bark can be hard to ID again unless you're staring at trees all day like me. You're probably not going to be able to ID trees by their bark, but bigleaf maple bark is really quite smooth when young. When it gets older, it takes on this grooved appearance, but not quite as grooved as Oregon ash, again, if you were comparing those two. And then in terms of habitat, I mentioned it likes moist but relatively well-drained soils. It also grows, as I mentioned, kind of like a weed, right? It has very vigorous growth, and one part of that is it is a vigorous stump sprouter. So in areas where maples have been cut down, those trees respond. They come back with a vengeance, and tons of different stumps, dozens of stumps will sprout back from that stump and take advantage of that existing root system, and they'll be able to grow really, really fast. This is like part of what I was talking about, where timber growers actually have a difficult time with maple and can actually be really difficult to kill, and they create these really big, wide spreading crowns that outcompete some of the timber trees, and they can grow and sustain multiple stems. So it'll sprout back with dozens, but over time that will thin out to 5 to 10 as the tree matures, but it will still be able to sustain several different stems. And that's part of all of these traits are part of what makes bigleaf maple such a great species for tapping, even if it does make it really quite a nuisance for timber growers. All right, so which trees to tap? So the general rule of thumb that we've derived from tapping in the eastern United States is that you shouldn't tap trees that are less than 10 inches at diameter at breast height. So diameter at breast height, although breast height can differ for people, is we consider it 4.5 feet off the ground. So if you're measuring a tree at 4.5 feet off the ground, measuring the diameter, which is from one side of the tree to the other, which you can do with a cloth tape, and then divide that number by pi, 3.14, that will give you diameter. And there's also diameter tapes that will just give you are already divided essentially and give you the reading, which I highly recommend. But with bigleaf maple being the weedy, difficult to kill species that it is, I think that it is possible to push this a little bit lower, maybe to 8 inches, because it does tend to grow a lot faster and is much less sensitive than the sugar maple, which these guidelines were designed for. But I wouldn't really go any less than 8 inches personally, unless you're dealing with these multi-stem clump trees, which I'll talk about how to approach that in a future slide. But these multi-stem clump trees are really great candidates. As you can see here in this picture on the right, we have a clump. This is all genetically one tree with 8 or 9 stems that are all tappable and can sustain a tap each, which is really pretty excellent. So avoiding trees that are sick, dying, or stressed is important, both because they're not going to produce as much, stressed trees are not going to produce as much sap or as high quality sap, but also you don't want to add to the stress of that situation and the stress that tree is experiencing. Trees with heart rot should be avoided, although it can be hard to tell if they're going to have heart rot until you are drilling into them, which I'll talk about later. And large old growth trees, there's kind of an anecdotal debate about whether or not those are worth tapping. And by old growth trees, I mean, 3 to 4 feet in diameter. My experience is that they don't actually tend to produce as much as some of the smaller trees. The University of Washington's research revealed that bigger trees are better, but that went up to about 24 to 28 inches in diameter. But some of those really big monster old growth trees, in my experience, don't seem to produce as much. Other people have said they're good producers for them, though, so that's just anecdotal. But I do think that there is an effect happening where the bark is so thick that you're accessing perhaps less of the sapwood. I think it could also take a harsher freeze or harsher freezing conditions to actually cause that sap flow mechanism in them too, because they're so large. All right, so in terms of site factors, these are important as well. Grade is really important depending on what kind of system you're using. So for instance, a very flat terrain is great if you're just going to hang buckets and bags off of trees, which is how most hobbyists will start, because that makes it really easy to get around and carry the sap and all of that. But if you're using one of these tubing systems, which we'll talk about, they use gravity to drain the sap, and you're going to want at least 5% grade to sufficiently drain that tubing and avoid it from kind of sitting in there and going stagnant. So grade is important. Water table is also important. Generally, sites with more water are going to do a little bit better because, of course, you need that water in the soil to create the sap later on when you get those freeze-thaw conditions. Elevation is important. Of course, for most landowners, your elevation isn't going to change that much from one side of your property to the other. And it's more of a macro site condition. But if you're at a higher elevation, you're probably going to experience more freezes and get more sap throughout the season. Now, that said, there are microsite conditions like frost pockets where trees might experience freezing a little bit more frequently, and those could be better candidates potentially for tapping. Proximity to the coast, this is another thing that came out of the University of Washington's research, is they just found that if you're really close to the coast, within 5 to 10 miles or so, especially out on the peninsula like Jefferson, Clallam, Grays Harbor County, really close out to the coast there, you get that temperature moderation effect that prevents freezes. So it's going to be a little bit harder to get that sap flow mechanism. It's less true for counties like Snohomish or Whatcom, which are on the Sound, a little bit more buffered inland. They tend to get some pretty good freezes still. But just something to consider if you're in that proximity to the coast and you get that temperature moderation effect by the water. And then site conditions like heavy metals or pollutants in the soil are also important to consider. By and large, most people are not really going to have to worry about this, but if you happen to know that an area that you want to tap was an old dump site and there might be, engine oil or something in there, heavy metals in the soil, I would avoid tapping in those spaces because trees can be really effective at it's what's called bioremediating some of those heavy metals. It's actually a method to restore some soils is to go and plant trees that are really good at absorbing some of those heavy metals. But ultimately, they can end up in the sap, more specifically in the sugar sands, which we'll talk about later. So if you happen to know that a site has a really, bad problem with soil pollutants, then I wouldn't really tap in that site. But for most folks, it's going to be not really something that you're concerned about. All right, so the basics of tapping. Timing is, of course, incredibly important. I mentioned that before. So this is one of the key things that all hobbyists should take away from this presentation is about timing when you drill your tap holes. All right, so we mentioned that the sap season starts as soon as temperatures can get below freezing. So that's November to March in Washington. Of course, that depends on your elevation. At higher elevations and further north, you're going to have a little bit longer of a season than, say, in the lowlands, just generally speaking. The real meat of the season tends to be about mid-December through the end of February, maybe into that first week of March. You don't really want to tap after March or after the buds start to swell in the spring. You want to make sure you pull your taps because you'll get what's called buddy sap, which tends to take on a strange flavor. So that's really when we know the end of the season is coming because you can get freezes even into April, but by then the buds have started to swell and that really affects the flavor of the sap. So that's the window for the season. But again, most of the big sap runs are going to be between mid-December and the end of February. Now, that doesn't mean that you should go out December 1st or December 15th and tap a tree and just kind of wait for the sap. So once you place your taps, once you drill that hole in the tree is going to start healing almost immediately. And those taps are only viable for 4 to 6 weeks. So it's really important for good sap flow that you're taking advantage of a fresh wound. That's why you want to tap right before or while the sap is flowing. And that means if you're confident that you're going to get a really good freeze overnight, you might tap the day before. but more likely you're tapping the morning after, having known that you got a really good frost. And by a good frost, we don't just mean it was 30 degrees for a couple hours. You really want sustained, like 6 to 8 hours at 30 degrees or less. That's what's going to give you some decent sap flow worth taking advantage. Or even better, when we get those hard freezes where we'll spend a whole day below freezing and we'll get some snow that sticks around for a few days. Those are what cause really great sap flow. So, but in those circumstances, you're tapping out there while the snow is on the ground. You're not doing it in anticipation, because of course you can get burned. Weather predictions are not 100%. They've certainly gotten better over the years. But you don't really necessarily want to bank on that. And of course, this requires keeping a really close eye on the weather. I joke that maple sugaring is not that much work. It's just a lot of work right now. And sometimes you kind of have to drop everything to do it. And sometimes that's not feasible for folks, and I understand that. But most of the time it can work out, and you can work it around a work schedule as well. But it does require keeping a close eye on weather predictions throughout the season. So taps and bits. So you want to use a drill bit size that matches your tap size. Obviously, 9 times out of 10, that's going to be a 5/16 drill bit, something most people have around in their garage for sure. So you want to drill a hole straight 2 inches deep into the wood. I have a video here, sort of low quality. I have to forgive the fact that I'm holding the phone in one hand and trying to pull the drill out with the other, and found I didn't have enough leverage to do it without shaking the camera a whole bunch. But you can see there, the shavings that came out were nice and white and fresh. If you saw any brown or rotten wood coming out when you were drilling that hole, you would have wanted to move on to the next tree. That can introduce all kinds of bacteria and fungi, and frankly, it's not good sapwood, so it's not going to produce much sap. So once you've got your hole drilled, you place your tap immediately and use a hammer to gently, or rubber mallet to gently hammer it in. You don't want to put your full weight behind it. And you keep tapping and tapping until it's secure. Oftentimes you'll hear a little pitch change in the when you're hitting the tap, it'll change pitch, and you'll kind of know it's secure in the tree there. So there's lots of different types of taps as well. There's the big decision really is plastic versus metal for hobbyists. At scale, at any sort of commercial scale, you're not using metal, you're using plastic because it's just too expensive to go with metal. But for 20 to 25 taps or in that range, metal is totally feasible. They're great. They'll last forever, and you can clean them really easily. They're stainless steel, so they clean really well. So that can be a great route for the hobbyist. But plastic can also work too. I mean, you can reuse the plastic. It's a little difficult to get completely clean like the stainless steel is, but certainly can be reused. So placement and number of taps. So this is where we'll talk a little bit about managing these multi-stem trees and like where you can put your taps on the tree. The question I always get is vertically, where should I be placing my tap? And according to the theory of sap flow, which is that the sap is coming from sort of the top of the tree after having gone through that freeze and thawing and moving its way down. In theory, you would access more sap by tapping lower in the tree. But ultimately, in the grand scheme of the height of the trees you're tapping, it's really going to be a negligible difference to tap, at eye level or chest level compared to like down on the ground. So it's really up to you. I recommend doing what's easiest, frankly. If you're using buckets and you're hanging them off the tree, you certainly don't want to put it high up because that's going to be really difficult to get off. And if you don't want to lift a bucket of water off the ground too, and you just put it at chest level, that can be a little bit easier. Generally, though, you do want to avoid knots, crooks, crotches, anywhere on the tree where you're getting a lot of tension wood. That's not gonna produce as well as a place with nice clean sapwood. So that you can have technically more than one tap per tree if you have a big enough tree. So 10 to 20 inches would sustain one tap, 20 to 25 inches could sustain 2 taps, and then greater than 25 inches could sustain 3 taps. But we never do more than 3 taps. And one of the reasons for that is as you're tapping, you're creating scar wood that you have to avoid in future taps and future seasons. So this is part of that sustainability of ensuring we're not creating too much scar wood, not taking too much from the tree, and we can sustain tapping over time, which I will talk about on the next slide, actually. So, working with multiple stems in the tree, as I mentioned, stems over 10 inches, they can each be treated as an individual tree, which allows for more taps per tree. So, in that picture I showed before where I had multiple stems over 10 inches and each one had a tap on them, I can do that for years and years, which is really great. It's a really big benefit of tapping bigleaf maple. So in smaller stems and or clumps with or multi-stemmed trees with smaller stems, a little bit younger, like what you see here on the right, you may be able to get around that 10-inch lower limit by tapping. There's a couple different approaches here. One would be to tap the stems that you think aren't really going to make it, the ones that are kind of getting thinned out. And you can see here that there's some stems like this that are a little bit smaller, this one and this one here. If I look up and I see that those canopies of those individual stems are pretty weak, you can get a really strong sense that the tree is kind of weeding those stems out, and it can't hurt to tap them. They won't produce as much sap as the bigger stems, but you're not really affecting the long-term health of the tree or your ability to tap the tree in the future by tapping these stems that are already going to thin out, especially if you're going to go, you're going to go and thin them out next year or something like that. So that's one approach. Another approach would be to tap some of these bigger stems, but essentially alternate between them each year. So every time you tap, you move to a different stem. So each stem gets a break and is allowed to continue to grow until they hit that 10-inch mark. And then they can be each tapped at the same time. So that's an approach if this is what you're working with. If this is all you have is slightly smaller stems and you really don't want to have to wait, 5 years for them to get 10 inches. That can be an approach. It's certainly pushing your limits a little bit, but I think again, because bigleaf maple is so vigorous and so difficult to kill sometimes, that it would probably go fine for you, as long as you're following those methods and not placing a tap on each of these or multiple taps. Okay. So one of the biggest reasons for this, as I alluded to, is that when you're tapping, you're creating scar tissue. So some people may be familiar with the phrase, people heal, trees seal. And what that's referring to is that when we're wounded, if I cut my finger, my body's going to cover that with a scab and then it'll heal over and I may have a scar, but ultimately, that finger's going to stick around. With trees, most of the time, what they're doing is if you get wounded, if that tree gets wounded in an area, it just completely seals it off and then says, I'm done with that. I'm not allocating any resources to it. It seals it off so that as it rots, none of that bacteria will get into the rest of the sapwood and it won't affect the health of the tree. So they just seal off wounds and kind of forget about it. They don't really try to regrow that wood. So when you're tapping and drilling a hole, and you can see here, these are old tap wounds, they're not refilling that wood with sapwood. You're never going to be able to tap that space again. It's why we call it non-conductive wood, or it's just tap scars. There's a lot of ways to refer to it. So you can't tap in the same spot twice, and that's a really important component for that sustainability piece. So as I mentioned, trees begin healing immediately and should be tapped every 4 to 6 weeks if you're trying to take advantage of a fresh wound and get good sap flow. And really that kind of comes down to you and how your season's gone so far, how much time and interest you have in retapping again within the season. Because again, our sap season goes from December to February. It's totally possible that you could tap 3 times in a season. But the situation would be where you want to take advantage of a really good sap flow. So for instance, if you tapped on early January, you had a good sap flow, and then it's coming up on February, maybe February 1st, you see the weather is looking good for another really good sap flow. You have to decide, do I want to go and retap, or do I want to see what I get out of my existing taps, even though they're 4 weeks old? and I might not get as much. So it's really kind of a your choice situation. I personally don't tap more than twice in the season, just to kind of make it easier to sustain that tapping long term. But it's up to every person, and again, your time is going to be a big factor in that. So regardless of whether you're tapping within the season, retapping within the season, or tapping in future seasons, there is a tapping pattern that helps you keep track of that previous scar wood and avoid it in the future. And what that looks like is to essentially go 1 to 2 inches down, or 1 to 2 inches over, and then 1 to 2 inches, or 10 to 12 inches down. Sorry. And the reason for that is you can see how this scar looks vertically on the tree in this picture right here. The scar is about 1 to 2 inches wide, and it goes 10 to 12 inches down and 10 to 12 inches up. So by following that pattern of that scar wood, going 10 to 12 inches down and 1 to 2 inches over, we avoid that scar tissue completely. So that's how that tapping pattern works. And then you can go 10 to 12 inches up and 1 to 2 inches over, and then just keep doing that until you work your way around the circumference of the tree completely. By the time you get back to this face of the tree again, you will have put on enough sapwood growth to be able to tap that area again without hitting scarwood. So that's the idea behind a tapping pattern. All right, so one of the questions I always get is, how many taps and trees will I need? Is it worth it? Should I even do this if I only have one tree? And that's totally up to you. I know people that have one tree and, they might get like a quart or a half a quart of syrup, and they had fun doing it. And other people, that's not worth their time. So this is all up to you as a hobby as to whether or not you want to invest in that. But really, it kind of depends on a lot of factors. Ultimately, I can't ever tell you how much your one tap is going to produce. Tree size obviously has an influence on it. As we mentioned, bigger tends to be better. Elevation and latitude. Where are you? If you're up in Bellingham, east of Bellingham, and you're at 400 or 500 feet, you're going to get much better freezing conditions than at 0 feet elevation next to the water or something like that. So water table, obviously, and site conditions that we mentioned before. Variability in the season. We have good seasons and we have bad seasons. We have seasons where we have lots of good freezes, and we have seasons where it's just pretty mild and we don't really get any hard freezes. So that's obviously going to affect sap flow. And to some degree, it's a little bit how that tree is feeling that day or that season. One of the things every hobbyist will tell you is they have trees that are finicky, they have trees that are great producers, and they have trees that are duds that just never produce for them for some reason. And you kind of learn that over the course of multiple seasons. And, some trees will produce one year and then they won't produce the next year. And it's kind of uncertain as to why that is, but you as the landowner, person tapping your trees, you're going to have to get to know your trees a little bit better. And so here's a conservative estimate for hobby scale, just to kind of put some numbers to it. Let's say you have 15 taps. You got a couple multi-stem trees that can sustain 3 or 4, a couple single stem trees out there. You put 15 taps out. Conservatively, in a pretty bad season, you could expect about 5 gallons per tap over the season. And that's over the whole season, 5 gallons per tap. At 1% syrup, or 1% sugar, rather, also called bricks, you need 86 gallons of sap to make 1 gallon of syrup. So with 15 taps, 5 gallons each, you end up with 75 gallons of sap and roughly 1 gallon of syrup. So that's not too bad. 1 gallon of Bigleaf maple syrup can go a long way. It's mentioned it has a unique flavor earlier. It's a very strong flavor, so you can make it last and do a lot with 1 gallon or half a gallon or even a quart. You can really do quite a bit with that. So at the commercial scale, for people that are interested in that, I can support that, outside of this webinar and talk more, but I wouldn't really do a commercial operation for less than 250 taps or so. I think it would be really important to have about that much to be able to guarantee you're going to have some syrup production, some worthwhile syrup production every year. All right, so this is the model that was developed by the University of Washington from their research, and it shows potential sap production per tap over the season across Western Washington. So it's a really cool map to look at and kind of look at where you are, what you can inspect. We do have this key down here, and I translated it to gallons from liters so we can get a better sense of what you might expect in your region. But this is really important is that this research is based on sap production under high power vacuum. And we haven't talked about vacuum, but essentially what that is adding vacuum to their tubing lines to really maximize sap production. I mean, and it can more than double the amount of sap you would get. So you really have to keep in mind that these numbers are the potential maximum possible sap in your region that you would expect. Based off of different conditions like elevation, latitude, and site, and stuff like that. So really important to note that this is a really high power vacuum scenario, which was reserved pretty much for commercial operations. So you could look at these numbers and maybe go 30% of that if you are doing buckets and bags, you might expect. All right, so sap collection. Lots of different ways to collect sap. Well, not that many ways, actually. Just different rearrangements of it. So buckets and bags are how almost every hobbyist is going to start. So if you're listening to this, trying to figure out how to tap for the first time, this is probably where you're going to go. And what that looks like is either buying buckets. Usually there are specialized buckets and taps that allow you to just hang them right off a tree like you see here. Or there's also bags, sap bags that you can hang right off a tree like this. And those are specialized. You usually have to buy those from a sugaring supply company. The alternative would be to buy some plastic taps and a little bit of that tubing. It's that stuff that more, advanced hobbyists or commercial sugar makers would use, and then just take a little bit of it and lead it to a food grade bucket on the ground. And this is a really cheap approach to it because these, the sugaring suppliers are going to sell kits. They're going to upcharge them a little bit. This will be a little more expensive, but it is, ready to go. It's just one purchase. So it's I get the convenience of that for sure. But if you're trying to, save a little bit of money, this is a really pretty cheap way to go about it. Ultimately, I mean, the bucket's like $3 or $4, and then you've got just 50 cents of materials here, although you do have to buy it in larger quantities. So the pros of this: minimal setup, more or less minimal maintenance, easy to determine better producing trees and which trees aren't producing anything. So once you advance into a tubing system where all the trees are connected, you can no longer tell which trees are better producers. It's really difficult without expensive sensors and stuff like that. The cons, of course, you're doing the physical labor. You're not letting gravity or vacuum take the sap to a single location. You're going out there with your truck or your side by side or just you walking out there and carrying all that sap back. And maybe that's not a real big deal. The other thing is that these bags and buckets must be cleaned regularly. One of the things that's unique to the Pacific Northwest, we have mild winter days, routinely in the 40s, 50s, even up in the low 60s. That really accelerates bacteria growth. So you want to make sure that you're cleaning these routinely. Flushing them out with water can be good short term, but every so often you're going to want to clean them with a bleach solution. I'll talk about that later. One thing too, don't use milk jugs or don't use any containers that may have contained dairy. And if you're going to use containers that contain food previously, nothing with dairy or meat. I mean, some of this is common sense, but those milk jugs I've seen people try to reuse, and you just can't get them clean enough to get the bacteria that was present in that milk out. So I don't recommend doing that. If it's just a water jug, that's fine, but don't use old milk jugs. So tubing, it would be the next step up. And it's totally feasible for a hobbyist, probably not in their first year, but maybe as they kind of dig into it a little more, to put up, one or two of these tubing lines in place of the buckets and bag system. So what this is 3/16 or 5/16 plastic tubing that, again, it connects all of these taps together and drains them to a single location, a single tank, usually. And it's just held up through the trees by tension, and there's different fittings that kind of plug them all together. So the pros of this, obviously, you're not carrying sap. You can improve sap flow through natural gravity. So that is true for 3/16, the smaller diameter tubing. What's happening there is that with sufficient sap flow and sufficient grade, so a sufficient elevation drop from the bottom of the line up to the top of the line, say 20 to 30 feet, as the sap flows through that line and it fills up the entire column, it has sort of a siphon effect that it creates a natural vacuum, which actually goes and pulls more sap from the tree. And so this has been shown to increase sap production without any sort of artificial vacuum or anything like that, especially if you have sufficient grade, which would be like, again, 20 to 30 feet drop between the bottom of the line and the top of the line. So for hobbyists that want to maximize production, without investing in expensive equipment, this 3/16 tubing can be really great. And it's pretty comparable in cost to buckets and bags, but it kind of depends on whether or not you're going to have to buy a tank, which there's lots of creative solutions to tanks. So you don't necessarily have to go out and buy an expensive stainless steel tank. But you can get creative with this and keep it relatively cheap. The cons, it requires setup, and that includes maintenance and monitoring. So you do have to clean these, right? These can get kind of gross, especially when temperatures get warm. So flushing those with water and a bleach solution periodically will really help. You can just take the lines down and submerge them in a bleach solution. That tends to work pretty well at small scales. And you also have to watch out for squirrels. Squirrels will get in there and chew for the sugars and the salts, and so they're going to be more of a problem than deer, which a lot of people assume deer or elk will have a hard time and crash into these, but these seem to avoid them really well. It's really the squirrels you got to worry about. And of course, it does require good slope, and that means that whatever collection tank you're using has to be at the bottom, and that could be in the wrong direction from where you're trying to process it, and that can make things difficult. So you have to think about that sort of infrastructure that comes with using a gravity system. And then, higher up, just to show you guys, what's going on at the commercial scale, at the other end of the spectrum, there's artificial vacuum, which I've mentioned, and there's two types. There's high power and low power. What you see here in this video is a low power vacuum, just called a sap guzzler, and that does help. It definitely increases sap yields, but a lot of times it's meant to just help facilitate that sap draining through the tubing systems rather than maximizing production. At high power vacuum, you can actually get sap out of trees without even having a freeze thaw event. So that's kind of why a lot of commercial users utilize it, because it maximizes existing freeze thaw or sap flows from freeze thaw events, and it can actually allow you to collect sap without freezing temps. Obviously, this is super expensive. No hobbyist is going to be investing in these necessarily, unless it's just you really got a lot of passion for it. And it does require pretty regular monitoring for vacuum leaks, which can be kind of a pain. All right, so dealing with bacteria, I've mentioned bacteria a couple of times. This is really important in the Pacific Northwest because of our mild winter days. Now, we're not worried about this from a food safety perspective necessarily. We're really worried about this from effects on syrup flavor. So what happens there is the sugar that's in the sap that comes out of the tree raw is mostly sucrose. And then as bacteria, and actually really it's yeast, mostly yeast that does this, gets into the sap, it will convert that sucrose into fructose and glucose, which are more burnable sugars, and that will affect the flavor after you're done evaporating and boiling, which can adds heat to it and caramelization, and so that will affect your sap flavor. To get a particularly light flavored syrup, you need to process it soon and before much exposure to yeast and bacteria. Darker syrups are going to be have been left a little bit longer, generally speaking. So these are the kind of the guidelines that come out of the eastern U.S. Now, it's a little bit different for the Pacific Northwest because big leaf maple syrup is an inherently darker syrup, but you can still get lighter grades of that, and typically you're doing that by processing that sap really quickly before it gets much exposure to yeast and bacteria. Now, some people can say, they actually like those caramel flavors, and there's nothing wrong with that. So, you might not have a problem with your sap sitting a little bit longer to make sure, to get that flavor. But that said, if you let it sit too long, it goes from just a nice caramel to like a sort of acrid, acidic flavor. And if you let it go really, really long, you get what's called ropey syrup, which is exactly what it sounds like. It's very goopy. It's not something that anybody really wants to eat. So it's not necessarily all good, and you kind of have to toe that line a little bit. Generally speaking, at the hobby scale, you're going to want to process that sap as quickly as possible because you're really not going to be getting to it. It's going to be hard to get to it early enough to get that really light flavor. You're already working against it because you don't have the technology and equipment that makes it easier to process quickly. So again, processing sap quickly is important. What I mean by that is you want to go out, if you've got buckets and bags, you want to drain those or empty those buckets pretty much once a day, maybe more than once a day if you can, and process that sap. And processing could mean throwing it in your evaporator and boiling it if you're doing that right away. But some people at the small scale for hobbyists will actually go and they will freeze their sap, and they'll keep it all season and kind of keep accruing sap and then process it all at the end. And that's a good strategy as well, especially if you have reverse osmosis, which reduces the amount of water, which we'll talk about later. So, but whether you're flash boiling and just kind of doing one long boil over multiple days and just adding sap every day as you collect it, or freezing, whichever one, you want to process it pretty quickly and not let it sit out there for too long. Other tips: use stainless steel if you can, but it is obviously going to be a little more expensive. So other types of containers and stuff work just fine. Like you can use plastic, but make sure it's a tank that you can reach in and clean really easily. If you get a tank that is hard to clean on the inside, I don't really recommend that. Clean buckets, bags, tanks regularly. Avoid fragrant cleaners. Don't use lemon Lysol or anything like that. And the reason for that is you're concentrating the sap, and you're also going to concentrate any remnant of that cleaner that might be in that sap, and that can affect the flavor. So with tubing systems, you want to avoid sags where sap collects and stays. So flush tubing, we kind of talked about that. Generally speaking, there are a number of different things you can use to clean, fragrantless cleaners that you could use. I recommend a bleach solution of 400 parts per million to 600 parts per million and 20 minutes of contact time in your tubing, or scrubbing out your buckets with this bleach solution is going to work really well. And the beauty of bleach is that it breaks down into essentially salt and water. So it's really it's pretty good for cleaning out in the woods without having too many detrimental effects. So just briefly, I want to touch on sugar bush management, which is forest management for big leaf maple sugaring. We could spend a whole workshop on just this, but just some highlights here. The first is obvious. Fast diameter growth equals more sapwood to tap. So whatever you can do to make sure your trees are happy, healthy, and vigorously growing is going to support your tapping. And that could mean, going out and thinning trees, or thinning out those multi-stemmed trees to the number of stems you think they'll be able to support long term. Those are really good activities to ensure lots of fresh sapwood to tap every year. Avoid spreading heart and butt rots. This really comes down to just if you're doing any pruning, doing it during the dormant season tends to be best. Other than that, there's not a whole lot you can do to mitigate those. But if you can reduce your pruning to when, basically between November and March, that is ideal for avoiding spreading those heart and butt rots. Remember, bigger is better up to a point. We talked about size of trees. So thinking about size and maybe when you might harvest, or even coppice, which is the next point, is that multi-stem trees means more taps and ultimately better yields. So you could actually manage for multiple stemmed trees, and that's called coppicing. What that would look like is if you have a single stem maple tree, to cut that down at the base and then manage the sprouts that come back afterwards. That's what's called coppicing. And obviously, it's going to take time, right? If you're getting rid of a stem that you want to tap in order to tap multiple stems, in 5 to 10 years, that's a process. But if you have a lot of maple to play with, that can be something that would be something to experiment with for sure. And then I want to do a quick plug for the Natural Resource Conservation Service's Conservation Stewardship Program in Washington State offers payments for sugar bush management. So what that looks like is you could enlist to do certain enhancement activities like going out and planting more maple, or to looking at a maple stand like this that's mostly maple, thinning it out a little bit and introducing some diversity, whether that's shrubs or native trees or what have you. And then though you can receive an annual payment for multiple years in that program, and you can put that money towards new sugaring equipment. So I really like to point hobbyists in the direction of that program that are, forest owners that might own something like this, and maybe not in your first year, but something to think about in subsequent years. All right, so on to the processing. And what you might find as you get into this is that if you're like me, you really like one half of this more than the other. For me, I'm an out in the woods guy. I love going out and collecting sap and tapping trees and really maximizing that end of things, making it really efficient. The processing side is my less favorite half. I still enjoy it. But you might find, and this is where it's really great opportunity to build community. You might work with your neighbors or someone in your family, maybe your kids or something that has an interest in this processing part. And it's a really great opportunity to complement skill sets, I think. I wish I had someone that would, loved the processing part that would allow me to kind of go and handle the wood stuff and someone can handle the processing stuff. But more often than not, if you're trying this for your first time, you're going to be doing both. But if you've got, family or friends to help you, it's always useful. And if you have neighbors that also might be collecting sap, a boil is more efficient the more sap you have. So I do recommend, trying that out. And again, it's great community building. All right, so starting with sugar content and testing, you've got your sap, it's in your tanks, or maybe it's frozen in your freezer, or whatever. One of the things that's good to know, you don't necessarily have to know, is how much sugar is in that sap raw. And we also call that Brix, and it's just the percent sugar by volume. So big leaf maple sap is usually between 0.7 and 1.5%, usually 1 to 1.3%, really in the middle there is where you see most of the sap sugar percentage. So what that means is, that determines how many gallons of sap you need to make 1 gallon of syrup. And so what we use is called the Jones rule of 86. Which is really just to divide 86 by the sugar content to understand how many gallons you need. So if your sap came in at 1.2% Brix, 86 divided by 1.2 is 72 gallons. That's how many gallons of sap you need to make 1 gallon of syrup. And that's because syrup requires a Brix of 66 to 69. Some people say 68%. So ultimately, you're going from that 1% up to 67%. Roughly. So you're getting rid of a lot of water in the process. So that's why it can be helpful to know how much sugar is in your sap to start with, but it's not necessary. Again, if you're a hobbyist and just beginning, you don't necessarily need to know that. You just throw it in the evaporator and boil it until it turns to syrup. And so, but the thing is, Brix can be tested with a number of different tools, like a refractometer. It can also be tested with a hydrometer. If people are familiar with that might brew their own beer. Hydrometers are used for that. They use the density of liquids to measure this stuff. So this on the right here that I'm circling is what I call a field refractometer. People that keep bees might know this tool well, because it tests sugar by putting light through it and looking at the refraction. So this is a really good tool to be able to test raw sap. If you want to be able to test raw sap all the way up to syrup, a digital refractometer can be useful. This is about $80 or so. And they also have different hydrometers, so you'd have to buy multiple different ones that can test sap and ones that can test at higher sugar percentages. Now, alternatively, if you just want to kind of try it the first year without investing in too much, you can just use a candy thermometer to determine how that sap is approaching syrup while you're boiling. And that's because syrup boils at 219 degrees Fahrenheit. That's 7 degrees above water, which is 212 degrees Fahrenheit. So if you're boiling syrup and you got your thermometer in there, and once it hits 219 up to 220, if you can get a thermometer that has a decimal point, that can be really helpful, because I found it's right between 219 and 220 is when you hit that 67% sugar mark, or right in that range. So that can be a really cheap solution to this sugar testing process. All right, so the whole process consists of this. So I broke it down into 4 steps, which is a hard boil, a finishing boil, filtering, and storing. Now, we'll start with the hard boil, but I want to note first and foremost, always do the hard boil outside. A lot of people are going to be tempted to do this inside, and unless you're dealing with maybe a quart of sap or something really low, which might give you maybe a spoonful of pre-syrup, don't do it inside. You put off a lot of steam in this process, as you can see in these videos, and that can lead to black mold issues in your house, or there's even been horror stories of in old houses, the moisture building up and ceilings collapsing. So unless you have some sort of industrial grade fan to put that steam outside, I really strongly advise against doing this hard boil, this first stage, inside. Do it outside, and there's lots of good solutions to that, which we'll talk about next. If I can get this to move, there we go. Yeah, so your evaporator is going to be the tool that you use to bring that sap all the way up to syrup. There are a lot of different options at varying costs. We'll touch on homemade options, hobby options, or designer hobby options, I guess. And then all the way, we'll even look at some of the professional evaporators, because they're cool to look at. So, what you see on the right here is a really great homemade solution. An evaporator it consists of 2 parts, an arch, which contains the heat source, and a pan, which holds the water, or the sap rather. And the whole point is to create the most efficient boil. And you do that by making sure that the heat source, the arch is really efficient at channeling the heat towards the pan and having lots of surface area in the pan. And there's other strategies we'll talk about that really increase the efficiency of the boil. And we measure the efficiency of a boil by how many gallons of water per hour it can boil off. So on the right here, we just have a stainless steel stock pot sitting over a fire ring, held up on a grate by 2 cinder block piles, essentially, and a fire underneath it. So this is not a terribly efficient strategy or pan arch combination, but it is really cheap. And I think it's really creative, and I like to see this, because this is something that you can just put out there and keep, as you said, keep adding sap. Go out and collect from your buckets once or twice a day. Pour it in the bucket. Just keep that water going. Check on it once a day. If you work from home, it's perfect. And this costs almost nothing. So, you could go and get the stock pot if you don't have one from Goodwill. Get some cinder blocks lying around the house or something like that. So this is going to be on the lower end of efficiency for sure. You might only get 1 to 2 gallons per hour of efficiency. But it's great if you only have a few taps. And it's, again, really cheap. So if you wanted to step up from that, you did that one your first year. Now you had a lot of fun. You want to step up. You can build what's called a cinder block arch. And these are also pretty cheap. Cinder blocks aren't too expensive. And what you're doing here is you're sort of enclosing the heat. and you can even put fire brick in there to make it more efficient. I put down some landscape rock to just protect the soil there, and insulate it a little further. And then the pan sits on top of this, and boils from there. So this is another pretty cheap solution. That's certainly, I think this only costs, the arch itself costs less than $100. The pan, which I have a picture of later, costs a little bit more, but there's cheaper solutions to that as well. And something like this is going to get, higher in the 7 to 10 gallons per hour range. And then there's the hobbyist evaporators. These are specifically designed for maple sugaring. This is my evaporator. I didn't mention this, but I operate a demonstration site in Olympia where I make maple syrup, and this is something I upgraded to after using this more backwoods, cinder block arch. So this is way more efficient, and it gets 10 to 30 gallons per hour. Great for like 50 to 200 taps. This would be considered an advanced hobbyist or maybe small. Great for like a small scale boutique commercial operation. And it's going to cost, a couple $1,000s, especially one of the things that's real difficult in our region is shipping, and because we often have to buy these from, Wisconsin, New York, and those states. So it's going to be a little pricier, but way more efficient. And then way on the other end, just to show you what the commercial operations use, is these really high-end, super efficient evaporators with all kinds of gadgets like auto draw-offs and filters and bottlers. It's really, really quite remarkable to look at. So the pan, as I mentioned, there's the arch and the pan. There's lots of different ways to make these more efficient, and the pan is a big part of that. But there are cheap options that are pretty efficient. One of those is the stainless steel restaurant pans. So these obviously can handle really high heat. They're good because they're nice and flat compared to like a stock pot, so they spread out the surface area exposed to heat a little more. And this, as you can see, can sit on a cinder block arch quite well. So these setups are actually quite nice and really quite cheap still, probably under $150 or so. Now, an upgrade from there would be buy like a hobbyist pan, just the pan and not the arch. And that's what I did here. I bought a refurbished divided pan. And what that means is that, so first of all, big wide flat pan, which is great. It's this one was 4 by 2, I think, 4 feet by 2 feet. Anyway, and it's divided into 3 compartments, and there's a slat under each of these that allows the sap to essentially flow. New sap poured in here. As it boils, it flows up and down all the way down here and pours off here, and it creates a sugar gradient where here is the more dense sugar, pre-syrup, what we would even call it, at a higher sugar content, and this is the raw sap, and that creates a more efficient boiling process. And then at a higher end, more expensive, this is the bottom of the hobbyist evaporator that I showed you that I use now. And it has what's called a drop flue. And so sap runs through all of these lines here. And that greatly maximizes the exposure to heat, and it really hypercharges the efficiency of that boil. So again, as you do this, you'll come up with different ways to create a more efficient boiling system. But again, starting out with just a stock pot and a fire is totally fine. A great way to start with your first try. So firewood is the best fuel at the hobby scale. If you have reverse osmosis, which we'll talk about later, then gas becomes feasible. But if you're just processing from 1% sugar all the way up to 67, gas is really not feasible. I don't really recommend it. If you can create a situation where you can use firewood, I do recommend that because it's cheaper. And frankly, if you own any kind of forest land, you probably have some firewood lying around. So one thing about during the boil is to watch out for foam buildup. You can see a little bit of foam building up here. This is not problematic, but it can create big puff clouds of foam. And what this does is that foam burns and adds a burnt flavor to the syrup, which you may not mind, but generally the strategy is to prevent foam buildup, and that can be done really easily by actually just using a little bit of vegetable oil and spraying it when you see the foam starting to build up. There's also like glycol powder mixtures that prevent that foam buildup as well that the commercial operations use. Because it's hard, once the foam builds up, you want to remove it to avoid that flavor from getting in your syrup, but there's actually a lot of sugar in that foam, so you don't really want to remove it. You really want to prevent foam from building up if you can. So other tips for increasing efficiency: warm your sap before you enter it if you can. Insulating the stove with ceramic wool and fire brick, or the arch essentially. And we talked about increasing surface area exposed to heat, and then reverse osmosis. I've mentioned this a couple of times, and we can talk about it now. So as I mentioned, this is the technology that has essentially leveled the playing field for the Pacific Northwest. And some people may be familiar with what reverse osmosis is as a water filtration system. Some people have a reverse osmosis in their house to get them purified water. So in the context of maple sugaring, what this does is it concentrates sugar content in sap by drawing out purified water. So every time, let's say you have 100 gallons of sap, just pull an easy number, at 1% sugar, if you put 100 gallons through a reverse osmosis, you're going to come out with 50 gallons of sap at 2% sugar, and then you'll have 50 gallons of purified water to pour off or do whatever you want with it. You can run it through again, and you'll get 25 gallons of 4% sugar. And if you have a good enough evaporator, you could go through again all the way up. At 8%, you're removing 90. If you can get it up to 8% sugar, you're removing 90% of the water. But even at 4%, you're removing 75% of the water. So this is a massive savings in time and energy. And again, it's kind of what makes it possible to make syrup with low sugar percentage sap at the commercial scale, which Bigleaf maple definitely qualifies as. So, as you might guess, a lot of this is more for commercial operations because these equipment can be quite expensive, but there are hobby scale options that are really effective. And they range from $300 to $500. This is the RO bucket. There's another one called the Nano RO. So they don't move as fast, but they can still get sap up to 4%, which again removes 75% of the water. And so if you try this out, again, it's probably not a first year purchase, but as you try this out and maybe enjoy it more, want to invest more in it, this could be a really great option for saving you time, especially if you're adding taps, right? Because that ultimately means more boiling. But I don't want to take away from the process of the long boil, as I like to call it, going from 1% all the way up to 67%. As I mentioned, there's a lot of community building there. You can invite your neighbors over to bring their sap, take turns putting wood on the fire, or just go out yourself and sit by the fire and throw wood on. It's a great way to relax too. So there's nothing wrong with not using reverse osmosis, but I wanted you to know that this technology is out there and that it is available at the hobby scale as well. All right, so after the hard boil, you want to take your what we would call pre-syrup at this point off of the sort of really high, less controlled heat and bring it to a more refined, controlled heat to bring it all the way up to 66 to 68% sugar. So you're typically drawing off between 30 and 50% sugar. So once you've taken out about half of the water, I really push this. Frankly, I push it more towards 50% because I don't want to have to do a lot of boiling and using gas, essentially. So I might say more like 40 to 50% sugar. That way you don't really have to do that much boiling after that, but it's kind of up to you. But the whole idea of this is that it's just as you are concentrating the sugar and getting rid of water, it's gonna accelerate towards 67% faster and faster. So you want to be able to control that heat a little better. So as you're doing this, keep a close eye, use a low heat, watch for foam buildup again. What happens in these stock pots is if the foam builds up over the entire surface, gas can't escape and the syrup explodes. And trust me, I've done this. I've done this in the kitchen. My wife was terribly unhappy with me. I was upset, so you want to avoid that situation where the foam builds up over the entire surface area of the whatever you're boiling in, because that can be quite messy. So use a thermometer, refractometer, hydrometer, whatever, to watch for that sugar content. As you can see in this picture here, this pre-syrup is at 215.4. I would be pulling it off once it hits like 219.3 to 5 or something like that, if I was only using my thermometer. And again, you're drawing off, or if you're using a refractometer, draw off between 66 and 68%. You might actually draw off a little bit earlier just to allow for some residual boiling, right? Because it doesn't just cool off as soon as you turn the heat off necessarily. So you have to kind of keep that in mind. So why do we use this 66% number, 66 to 68? It's a really good question. Above 68%, you can start to get crystallization, which is the syrup turning to sugar in the jar, essentially. Not that bad, still edible, no big deal if it happens. Below that, that 66% number, you could have a high enough active water content in it to facilitate mold growth or bacteria growth, and that's something that you don't really want. So it's, you may be dealing in small enough quantities of syrup that it won't have enough time to grow mold, but generally speaking, it's better to get it above that 66 mark. All right, so then it goes on to filtering. Once you're pretty confident that it's it's syrup and it's within or close to that range, filtering is optional at the hobby scale for sure. And what you're filtering out, though, is called sugar sands. And what happens is, during that hard boil process in particular, with the high heat, minerals are bonding to sugars, and they create this sort of brown, granular sugar sand. That's exactly what it sounds like. So it gives your syrup a real muddy appearance. It's not going to have that nice look of what it looks like on the shelves. So there's a number of different ways you can filter it off, but some people choose not to. I like to filter it out because the sugar sands do have a little bit of a bitter flavor, and they are going to affect your syrup to the final product. So the cheapest way is just to put it in the fridge, let it settle, and pour the syrup off. The sugar sands will sink to the bottom, and the syrup will, you can pour off the syrup over time. You'll lose a little bit of syrup in this process, but it's not a huge deal. You can use coffee filters. I don't really like using coffee filters. I would probably sooner settle and pour off, use that strategy, than use coffee filters. But I know some people that use them pretty regularly. Cone filters would be the next step up from there, and they are actually quite cheap. You can see these here. So they're just exactly what they sound like, a combination of polyester and wool filter shaped like a cone to sort of concentrate that pressure towards the bottom and push that sap through a filter. And these are pretty cheap and totally reusable. I mean, you can get a set of them for like $30 or less. One thing about them, though, is especially if you're dealing in small quantities of syrup, I don't know that I'd recommend these, because some syrup does get locked up in the filters, and you might find that you're losing quite a bit. So it's better with larger quantities. And then a more efficient system that you might see a hobbyist owning, but more likely a commercial operation, would be a flat filter system like this. So this also uses gravity, but there are some that have adapters so that you can hook a vacuum up, and it helps pull the sap through, or pull the syrup rather through, and filter it. And then beyond that, they have big expensive machines that are called filter presses, that are much more expensive and more for commercial operations, but much more efficient too. So always filter your syrup while it's hot. That's really important, because it's just, once it's cold, it's going to coagulate, or that's probably not the right term, but I think you know what I mean. It's going to thicken, and it's not going to filter as easily. So you want to filter the syrup while it's hot. Also, I save the sugar sands. I have used them in baking as sort of a substitute for molasses or even brown sugar. One of my favorites is actually to put the sugar sands in whiskey, and then filter out for a day or so, and then filter out the sugar sand. And I think what's happening there is that alcohol is stripping the remaining syrup from those sands, and it makes a really nice maple whiskey. So that's something you can do with the sugar sands as well. And then you can also feed them to livestock. You could throw them in your garden, right? It's just nutrients. So there's lots of other things you can do with them. They are edible. Okay, so packing and storing. So if you're just going to throw it in the fridge in a quart jar, a mason jar or something, it can last, up to a year. My experience is in those quantities, it doesn't last more than a month because people are consuming it because it's delicious. But, it can last up to if you've got it to that sufficient range of sugar, it'll last up to a year or so. One thing too, if you do see some mold growing on it, you actually can just kind of scrape the mold off and put it back on the stove, bring it up to 190 for several minutes and then it is just to kind of kill any of those mold spores, and you can eat it again at that point. Most people want to avoid that. I would want to avoid that as well, but that is an option. So canning and bottling, though, or more accurately, hot packing, because you don't really need a pressure canner or anything to can or bottle maple syrup. Instead, what you do is after you're done filtering, you bring your syrup back up to 190 degrees Fahrenheit, and then you bottle it hot, put the cap on, invert your bottle for 3 to 5 minutes to sterilize the top, and it's shelf stable. Of course, use sterilized, clean bottles. Should go without saying, but it can be shelf stable at that. And so that's the hot pack method, and it's kind of the standard for maple syrup. So if you do that in glass, it can last 5+ years. I've heard of it lasting decades. Plastic, they don't recommend letting it sit on the shelf for more than 2 years at that point. Then, of course, you can throw it in the freezer and it'll last pretty much indefinitely. And that's kind of what I do because I have freezer space for it and it's just easy. But this hot pack method works really well if you don't have the freezer space. Always refrigerate after opening, whether you hot packed it or not. Or hot packed it or froze it, you want to make sure you refrigerate it. And again, there's lots of applications here. You can use it in cocktails, cooking, baking. It's a great substitute for sugar in coffee, delicious over ice cream. And of course, it's great on pancakes. I like to think that it has broader applications than pancakes, but it is still delicious. I can't deny it. So I said I'd talk a little bit about commercial opportunities, and one of the reasons that this is just a viable commercial operation is that it's currently priced at $4 an ounce, or $400 to $500 a gallon, and that's as of right now in 2024. So that price could change, but it's been pretty stable since commercial operations started. 4 or 5 years ago now. So it's pretty exciting. It's an exciting opportunity for forest owners to make some supplemental income. It can actually be fairly lucrative, especially if you're in a place where you get really good sap flows. And the market, to excuse the cheap pun, is truly untapped. The few people that sell commercially in Washington do a lot of sales online. They routinely sell out of their stock. There's other opportunities to sell wholesale to restaurants and groceries, bars, direct at farmers markets and storefronts. We have big markets in Seattle and Portland, but even beyond that, there's other markets. There's opportunities to explore the sort of industrial food and beverage industry and see if they would be interested in buying maple sugar. So there's a lot of opportunity for growth. One thing to consider, though, if you are interested in a commercial operation, is that a commercial kitchen license is required in the state of Washington to sell Bigleaf maple syrup. So that is a regulatory hurdle. Right now, there is not a cottage food exemption for Bigleaf maple syrup in Washington. There is in Oregon. But as of right now in 2024, you can't produce at the cottage scale. You do need a commercial kitchen license. In the future, I could see too, for those that are like me and just really like being out in the woods but don't want to deal with all the processing, there is a very real potential to have a sap market and have forest owners be able to sell raw sap that they collect to commercial producers. Especially so, as this grows, and if someone produces maple syrup near you, within a reasonable driving distance for you to transport sap, you might reach out to them and see if they want to buy any of the sap that you collect. They will want you to, of course, be able to guarantee you're bringing sap fresh, right? They don't want any dirty or contaminated sap, so you have to work that out. But I think it could be a really good opportunity. And commercial producers of maple syrup are always wanting more sap because more sap makes an efficient boil. So there's other maple products too besides maple syrup. We talk only about maple syrup today, really. But you can keep boiling and take maple syrup all the way to sugar. There's other, candies like cotton candy, maple candies like this that are like just packed. And they're delicious. Maple cream, maple caramels. You can work maple syrup into different sauces, barbecue sauces. You could not bring it all the way to syrup. You could bring it to like 20 to 30% sugar and try to make wine with it. I did try to do this, but I don't know what I'm doing with wine, and I unfortunately failed. But someone out there that knows more about making wine might want to try this and tell me what I did wrong. And then there's products like maple water. This is something they do with sugar maple sap, is they bring it up to maybe 3 or 4% sugar with reverse osmosis. They probably are like, flash boiling it or pasteurizing it to some degree, and then carbonate it or not and sell it as tree water. And there's markets for that. So it's really, there's a lot of flexibility beyond just maple syrup here. But again, I never want to undersell the hobbyist. As I mentioned earlier, a lot of my work is going into supporting a commercial industry in Washington, a lot of others as well, at University of Washington, Washington Farm Forestry Association, Oregon State. We've put a lot of work into that. But the hobbyists present, they provide tremendous value as well. And maple sugaring at the hobby scale provides tremendous value to them. I think it is a great opportunity to foster connection to forest, create learning opportunities, get your family out there, learn about forestry, learn about tapping, learn about the value of bigleaf maple and forests in general. It gets people out in the woods and encourages active management. You're out there monitoring your woods. You might see something that you wouldn't have seen if you weren't out there collecting sap, 2 to 3 times a day or something. And it's an opportunity to stay pretty active during the winter months, which we all need. And I would say it still contributes to a developing sugaring market in this region, which is, could be through equipment sales, but public awareness, maple festivals, lots of agritourism opportunities there as well. So I never want to undersell the hobbyists. So that's all for this webinar. I want to say, though, quickly give you a shout out for some things coming down the pipe. Again, this is recorded October of 2024, having just received a WSDA specialty crop block grant to keep some maple sugaring work going. And that's going to include a number of things, including developing local equipment access to, that's a typo, developing local access to sugaring equipment. So hopefully getting some manufacturers around here to make evaporators and stuff like that. Developing an online Bigleaf Maple toolkit. So this would be a web page with guides and videos and webinars for people, particularly for people that want to do commercial operations, but there will be hobbyist information there as well. Developing forest farming trials to see what else we can grow in sugar bushes that would be commercially viable. Lots of other crops. There's a lot of shade tolerant specialty crops that can enhance the value of a sugar bush. And so we'll be trialing a few of those and seeing what works. We'll also be doing lots of outreach, farm walks, hobbyist workshops. I'll be developing a Bigleaf Maple sugaring school at some point for folks that are interested in commercial operations. Something that's not listed here is that I could also provide technical support to people that are interested in developing a commercial operation. So coming out and hopefully helping you design your system. And maybe limited in how often I can do that, but if that's something you're interested in, you should reach out to me. And this will all take place between 2024 and 2027. So here's some additional resources. Of course, you're free to just reach out to me directly, ask some questions. I'm happy to field those. Right now, we do have an Extension Forestry webpage. The hyperlink is listed there. This is where the toolkit will ultimately be, but right now it's kind of a loose list of some resources, some very helpful resources. Oregon Maple Tappers has a great website too as well with some guiding materials. Also in development is a working riparian lands toolkit. As of right now, this is not available yet, but it will be in the start of 2025, and that is the future link for that toolkit. And that will include guides on or resources for maple sugaring, as well as other practices like this, forest farming practices that could be applied to riparian lands to develop those working riparian buffers that I mentioned earlier. All right, well, that is it for me. I hope that you enjoyed this webinar. I hope that you all get excited about tapping whenever the next sap season is for you. And if you have any questions along the way, feel free to reach out.